Jacen Solo never had the chance to be ordinary. His name, even before he could speak it, came with history. It carried war, it carried prophecy, it carried fear. He was the son of Princess Leia Organa and Han Solo, the nephew of Luke Skywalker, the grandson of Darth Vader. By the time he was born, the galaxy had already decided who he was supposed to become. He wasn't seen as a child, he was seen as potential. And in that quiet, hidden wait, a fracture began, the kind you don't notice until years later, when silence becomes the only way to cope with being seen through someone else's expectations. Jacen didn't rebel, not the way others did. He didn't throw tantrums or defy orders. He asked questions, softly, carefully, questions that lingered longer than anyone expected. What does the Force want? Is peace the same as control? Can you feel someone's pain without trying to fix it? While his twin sister Jaina was fearless, sharp, confident, eager to act, Jacen always hesitated, not because he lacked courage, but because something inside him whispered that even the Jedi didn't always understand the cost of their own power, and if they didn't understand it, who would? He was young when he first felt it, the edge, that invisible line between empathy and collapse. In meditation, the Jedi taught him to let go of anger, let go of fear, let go of attachment. But Jacen felt everything. He felt the ache in his mother's silence after a Senate defeat. He felt the weight in his uncle's voice when he spoke of the old order. He felt the sadness in the Force when a dying creature on Yavin IV gave up its last breath. Letting go didn't come naturally to Jacen. He held on, not out of defiance, but because it felt wrong to walk past suffering with calm detachment. And still, he obeyed. He never shouted, never lashed out. He smiled when people needed him to. He played the part of the peaceful Jedi, even when that peace started to feel like a mask. When he trained at the Jedi Praxium, his instructors praised his sensitivity. They called him gifted. They said his connection to the living Force was rare, but even in their admiration, Jacen felt distance, like he was being studied more than understood, admired but not seen. And so, he kept quiet. He never said out loud that he didn't always agree with the code. He never told anyone that he feared he was feeling too much. He never asked why the Jedi were taught to protect life but not mourn it. Even Anakin, his younger brother, more bold, more reckless, couldn't understand why Jacen seemed to pause when the moment called for action, why he stood still while others rushed in. But Jacen wasn't frozen. He was listening, watching, trying to find the part of the Force that didn't demand, didn't command, just witnessed. He wondered if there was a version of the Jedi path where compassion didn't require silence, where love wasn't a threat, where peace didn't mean forgetting. He didn't find that path, not then, not in the temples, not in the texts. So he kept walking the one they gave him, quietly, and the galaxy watched him grow, the boy with the powerful bloodline, the calm voice, the careful questions. Everyone thought they knew who he was becoming. But Jacen didn't sit. And that uncertainty, that quiet ache under every lesson, every mission, every smile, stayed with him. Even when the galaxy changed, even when the war began, there was a time when Jacen Solo's smile was real. It came easily, shaped by laughter and quiet evenings with his family. But that time didn't last. And slowly his smile became something else, something he wore for others, even when it didn't belong to him anymore. The galaxy around him was shifting. Whispers of conflict stirred in the outer rim. The Republic's victories were fragile, and in the middle of it all, Jacen was expected to stand still, calm, composed, certain. But certainty had begun to escape him. During his teenage years at the Jedi Praxium, Jacen started to notice the cracks in the teachings, not because they failed to work, but because they worked too well. They trained him to control his feelings, to quiet his fears, to push down attachments, and for a while he convinced himself that was peace. But it wasn't sit peace, it was distance. He smiled in front of the younger initiates, taught them how to breathe through their doubts. He nodded during council lessons, repeating what was expected. He led meditations, lightsaber drills, and humanitarian missions. He played the role well. But at night, when silence returned, Jacen found himself staring at the stars and wondering why it all felt so thin, why the moments of peace felt hollow, why the Force seemed more distant the more he tried to control it. He thought of his mother, Leia, once a warrior, now a politician again. He could feel her exhaustion, though she never spoke of it. He thought of his father, Han, who never fully embraced the Jedi way, who always looked at his son like he wasn't sure if he was proud or afraid. Jacen never asked, he smiled instead. To Ben Skywalker, Luke's son, Jacen, was a mentor, someone calm, someone gentle, someone who could explain the Force without raising his voice. But even Ben couldn't see the tension behind the calm, the sense that Jacen wasn't teaching what he believed, only what he remembered being told. He began to feel disconnected from his peers, even from Jaina. His twin sister was fire, fast to act, quick to speak, never one to hide behind meditation. She loved him, but she didn't understand why he hesitated, why he seemed to be drifting further from the center. He didn't blame her, because how do you explain that you're scared of your own peace? How do you admit that every time you close your eyes, the Force doesn't calm you, it overwhelms you? Jacen felt everything. The tremors of pain in war-torn systems, the sorrow of families losing homes, the confusion in his fellow Jedi, even when they pretended to be resolute. He began to think there was something wrong with him. And so the smile became armor. It softened his words. It made him seem kind, approachable, trustworthy. He used it when Luke looked to him for leadership. He used it when Ben asked questions about loss. He used it when the Jedi Council asked for input, but didn't want disagreement. It was never fake, just borrowed. And in time, Jacen forgot what his real smile felt like. He carried this silence into adulthood, into missions, into diplomacy, into the quiet hours after battle, when survivors wept and Jedi meditated to wash away the horror. He didn't wash it away, he carried it. Because part of him believed that if he could bear enough pain, maybe others wouldn't have to. He never said this out loud, he just smiled. And in doing so, he slowly became what the galaxy wanted him to be. Not because he believed it, but because it was easier than explaining what he actually felt. Jacen had once believed the Force was freedom, that it opened you to possibility, to truth, to understanding. That belief stayed with him during childhood, held him steady through lessons, comforted him during missions. But as he grew older, the Force began to feel tighter, not smaller, but heavier, less like air, more like gravity. It happened slowly, not through a moment, but through years of quiet pressure. The Jedi told him the Force would guide him. That clarity would come through discipline, through letting go. But the more Jacen followed their path, the more it felt like he was walking in circles, repeating mantras, suppressing emotions, watching others do the same. He started to notice what wasn't being said, the unspoken grief in the Order's halls, the tension behind every council decision, the way the Jedi responded to galactic chaos with detached calm, even when entire systems were falling apart. Jacen could feel that chaos, not as noise, but as sorrow, as weight. He'd walk through refugee ships and feel the echoes of lost homes, sit in meditation chambers and sense fear pulsing beneath the surface. He heard it in children who smiled too hard, in soldiers who pretended they weren't afraid. And through it all, the Force remained silent. Or maybe not silent, maybe just indifferent. That was the part Jacen couldn't accept, that the Force, this infinite energy binding all life, might not actually care. Not in the way the Jedi taught him, not as a comforting presence, not as light conquering darkness, but as something vast and unreachable, like space itself. He began to question things more openly. Why do we avoid attachments if they give life meaning? Why is fear something to be discarded, when it's also a warning? Why does peace sometimes feel like pretending? His instructors reminded him of the code, that questions were natural but the path had already been walked, that the Jedi didn't seek control, they sought balance. That control was what led his grandfather to fall. But Jacen wasn't seeking control. He was seeking permission to feel, to grieve, to care. But no one said those words. No one gave him that space. So the Force, once a source of wonder, became a prison of contradictions. A system that promised truth, but only offered rules, that asked him to feel everything, and then do nothing with what he felt. He became distant, but never rebellious. Quiet, but never passive. He obeyed, he helped, he saved lives. But inside, the cage was closing. He found moments of stillness in nature, in the living energy of the galaxy. He studied the living Force, hoping it would answer the questions the Council couldn't. But even that path felt blocked, obscured by doctrines that didn't quite fit the world he saw. It was during this time that Jacen started to feel the possibility of something else. Not the dark side, not yet, but a different view. one not bound by codes or symbols or inherited morality, a view where the Force was not light or dark but choice, motion, change. But thinking that way meant stepping outside everything he had been taught, everything that gave his life structure, and even though the cage was closing, it was still the only thing keeping him from falling. So he stayed inside it. He did what was expected. And every day, the bars grew thinner, harder to see. Not because they disappeared, but because he was learning to pretend they weren't there. The galaxy was already trembling, borders were uncertain, factions were rising, shadows moved beneath treaties that no longer held weight, and somewhere in the quiet center of it all, Jacen Solo stood still, not as a warrior, not as a leader, but as a question no one had answered yet. He still walked the Jedi path, still wore the robes, still offered guidance with a gentle voice, but something inside him had stopped growing, or perhaps it had started changing in ways the Order couldn't see. There were moments when he almost spoke up, when he almost told Luke what he really thought, when he almost asked Jaina if she felt the same suffocation, when he almost admitted that the peace they were defending didn't feel real anymore. It felt like denial. But he never said those things, because there was always another mission, another student to guide, another Senate crisis to resolve. He kept moving, kept helping, kept smiling. And no one noticed that the boy who used to ask too many questions had stopped asking anything at all. Inside, he was drifting. He felt it during council meetings, that numbness behind every calm debate. He felt it during his meditations, where the Force now echoed more like a distant hum than a guiding voice. He felt it when he looked at his own reflection and saw someone who could still say the right things, but no longer believed them. He never turned against the Jedi, but he did begin to turn away. It wasn't rebellion, it was erosion, a slow wearing down of belief until all that remained was behavior, a structure without a foundation. And the galaxy didn't sit help. The Yuuzhan Vong had arrived. Their war was unlike anything the Jedi had faced. No presence in the Force, no clear morality, no balance to restore, just agony and death and terror spreading through the stars. Jacen watched the Jedi struggle to adapt, to fight enemies they couldn't sense. He watched the Republic falter, he watched systems fall, and through it all, the Order repeated its mantras: peace, patience, purpose. But Jacen saw the truth, none of it was working. People were dying by the millions, and the Jedi didn't have answers. They had ideals, and Jacen, who had once clung to those ideals for comfort, now saw them as something else. Inflexible, detached, irrelevant. Still, he didn't act, not yet. But his silence was no longer just about humility or control, it was about survival, emotional survival, because if he allowed himself to feel the full weight of everything happening, it would crush him. So he did what he said, always done. He kept the mask on. He let others speak. He let others lead. He waited, not because he lacked opinion, but because part of him still hoped that someone else, Luke, the Council, the galaxy itself, would offer a different path, a path that didn't require him to abandon either compassion or truth. But that path never came. And deep inside, something began to shift. Not a fall, not yet. Just a question, returning again in the quiet. What if everyone else was wrong? What if the code wasn't sit peace, but limitation? What if control wasn't a weakness, but a necessity? He didn't say these words, not out loud, not even to himself, but they waited for him, in the dark corners of his mind, in the dreams he couldn't remember, in the moments after battle when he stood surrounded by the dead and felt nothing. He was still Jacen Solo, but the silence was no longer protection. It was the warning before the storm. When the Yuuzhan Vong arrived, the Force went silent. Jacen didn't understand it at first. No one did. These invaders weren't just warriors. They were shadows outside the natural order. They bled, they fought, they screamed, but they couldn't be felt. Not through the Force, not through anything the Jedi had ever known. It was like facing ghosts. And for someone like Jacen, someone who felt everything, the absence was unbearable. Before the war, the Force had always been there, a whisper beneath every moment, a quiet signal that life still meant something. Even when things were hard, even when choices felt impossible, the Force offered some thread to hold on to, a presence, a sense of truth behind the chaos. But when the Yuuzhan Vong began their invasion, that thread snapped. Jacen could feel the pain of those dying, the fear of civilians, the confusion of soldiers. But the enemy, the source of that pain, was invisible to him, not just hidden, gone. He stood on battlefields and felt the Force screaming, not because it could sense the Vong, but because it couldn't. Entire worlds fell, millions died, and the Jedi were fighting blind. Jacen found himself facing something he had never trained for, not an enemy, but a void. And in that void, his questions began to twist. Was the Force still with them? Or had it abandoned this war? The Council tried to adapt. Luke encouraged patience, balance, discipline. He reminded them that even in darkness, the light remained, that Jacen wasn't sure anymore, not because he believed in the dark, but because the light wasn't answering. Every time he closed his eyes, he didn't feel clarity. He felt noise, grief, anguish from across the stars. And every time he reached out to understand the Vong, there was nothing there. It changed how he fought. He stopped relying on instinct, stopped trusting his visions. He began to hesitate in battle, not because he was afraid to kill, but because he didn't know if the Force could still tell the difference between right and wrong. He watched his friends adapt in different ways. Anakin, his younger brother, charged forward, determined to win, certain the Force would guide him anyway. Jaina hardened, became a soldier, tactical, focused. But Jacen? He pulled back. Not out of cowardice, but because something in him whispered that this war was revealing a truth the Jedi had long refused to see. That the Force wasn't Sith always a guide. That sometimes it just watched. The Yuuzhan Vong didn't just break planets, they broke certainty. They made Jacen feel something he had never felt before, alone inside the Force. Even during the worst years of his training, even when he doubted the code, the Force had still been there, still present, still real. But now the Force felt like a memory. And in its silence, Jacen started to wonder if the Jedi were wrong about more than just this war. He didn't say this aloud. Not yet. Because there were still people to save, still lives to protect, still missions to complete. But deep inside, he could feel it. This wasn't just a war against an enemy. It was a war against everything he thought he understood. And something inside him had started to fracture. The Jedi weren't meant to carry it all. That's what they told themselves. That's what the code insisted. Feel but do not hold. Act but do not cling. Grieve but let go. But Jacen couldn't let go. Not during the Yuuzhan Vong War. Not when every life lost echoed inside him like a scream he couldn't quiet. It wasn't just death. It was how it happened. Cities erased in hours. Entire species driven to extinction. Families slaughtered in the name of some alien doctrine the Jedi couldn't comprehend. Jacen could feel the shock before the silence. The way the Force recoiled, not from darkness but from absence. The Vong didn't bend the Force. They ignored it, and in return, the Force seemed to ignore them. But not the people dying. Those screams still came through. Jacen stopped sleeping through the night. Visions turned into something worse. Not prophecies, but memories from other people's pain. He'd wake up breathless, heart racing, as if he'd lived through deaths that hadn't been his. And in a way, he had. Because when you can feel what others feel, not just see it, but know it, the line between your pain and theirs disappears. He tried to hide it during missions, during meetings, around Jaina, around Anakin, around Luke, but his eyes betrayed him, and there were days when even silence couldn't hold back the pressure building in his chest. He began to wonder how the other Jedi weren't falling apart. Maybe they were better at shielding, maybe they didn't feel as deeply, or maybe they had accepted something Jacen still couldn't, that some lives couldn't be saved. But Jacen didn't want to accept that. He didn't believe that feeling more was a weakness. He believed it was the only thing keeping him human. Even as it broke him, he started making decisions without council approval. Smaller things at first, helping civilians before military targets, sabotaging Vong supply lines instead of following direct orders. Some Jedi noticed, some didn't. Luke cautioned him, told him to trust the greater strategy, told him to believe in balance. But Jacen didn't believe in balance anymore. Not when the weight wasn't evenly shared. He watched Anakin grow colder, watched Jaina become sharper, watched the war change all of them, not into warriors, but into survivors. And survivors don't think about morality. They think about tomorrow. But Jacen still thought about yesterday. Still carried it. Every face, every scream, every child that died screaming for parents who never came. Every parent who died thinking they failed. He didn't know how to stop it, how to carry less, how to let the Force numb it away. Because the Force wasn't numbing anything anymore. It was silent in ways that felt deliberate, like it was watching, judging, waiting to see what choices these Jedi would make when comfort was gone. So Jacen made his own choices. Not out of pride, not out of ego, out of desperation. If the Force wouldn't guide him, he'd follow pain instead. He'd listen to it, let it speak, let it shape his path. And every time he tried to push it away, it reminded him why he couldn't. Because every death he felt was a voice whispering the same thing. Do something. And Jacen was running out of reasons not to. Jacen remembered the funeral. Not of someone he loved, not someone close, just another Jedi, another casualty, another name in a list that kept growing. The ceremony was short, quiet. Jedi don't mourn loudly. They honor transition, not loss. And yet, as he stood beside the others, hands folded, posture composed, something inside him screamed. Not because of who had died, but because no one was crying. It wasn't pride, it wasn't strength, it was detachment, the kind the Jedi had been taught to believe in, the kind that said love must never become fear, and grief must never become possession. But Jacen didn't see serenity. He saw silence that had gone too far. This war was different. The Yuuzhan Vong weren't just killing people, they were unmaking meaning. They burned memories. They desecrated the dead. They forced choices that should have never existed. And through it all, the Jedi responded like diplomats, like tacticians, like statues wearing robes. But they didn't cry. Jacen did, in private, late at night. Not always with tears, but with the kind of stillness that turns your bones cold. He'd sit alone and feel the grief trapped in his chest like a wound that couldn't bleed. The Order had always warned about attachment, about how emotions could cloud judgment. But Jacen was starting to see a different danger, not in feeling too much, but in pretending not to feel at all. The younger students looked up to him. They thought he was calm, collected, a leader. But they didn't see him pause after missions. They didn't hear him whisper apologies to the dead. They didn't know how many times he reached for the Force and felt nothing but guilt. He started noticing things. How Master Kip Duron avoided funerals now. How even Luke seemed tired. Not in body, but in spirit. How the Order was splitting between those who wanted to fight harder and those who wanted to pull back. And how no one was willing to admit they were afraid. Because Jedi aren't supposed to be afraid. But Jacen was not of the Vong, of what the Jedi were becoming. Each battle pushed them closer to something they couldn't name. Each compromise they made, for strategy, for survival, for victory, chipped away at the ideals they claimed to protect. And in that slow erosion, Jacen saw a future no one else seemed to be preparing for. A future where the Jedi survived, but no longer felt. He tried to speak to Jaina. She brushed it off, said they had no time for reflection. People were dying. He tried to bring it up with Luke. Luke listened, nodded, advised patience. But patience didn't change anything. And Jacen couldn't stay silent anymore. So, he began writing, not to share, not for others, just to keep track of how many times he'd felt the urge to cry and didn't, of how many deaths he blamed himself for, even when he hadn't been there, of how many nights he heard children's voices in his sleep. It didn't make the pain stop, but it helped him remember who he was. Because in a galaxy where no one was allowed to break, Jacen was already breaking. And the cracks weren't shameful. They were honest. He didn't want to be the Jedi who survived the war by forgetting it. He wanted to remember every life lost, every scream ignored, every tear that never fell. Because someone had to carry the truth that feeling too much wasn't weakness. It was the last piece of humanity they hadn't surrendered. It didn't happen during a battle, not during some turning point marked by explosions or victory. It happened during a rescue, a quiet mission, a forgotten moon. Jacen had been sent with a small Jedi team to extract survivors from a refugee station on Artorias, a world already gutted by the Yuuzhan Vong. The damage was done. The skies were ash, the oceans poisoned, cities turned into graves. They found a handful of survivors, emaciated, trembling, half dead from exposure and grief. Among them was a child, no older than 6, silent, covered in burns. She wouldn't look at anyone, wouldn't speak. The medics said she'd likely never recover, mentally or physically. Jacen sat beside her for hours, said nothing. reached out through the Force, gently, not to read her, just to be present. And that sips when it happened. He felt nothing. Not silence, not darkness, just a void where life should have been. Not because she was dying, but because something in her had already died. The Yuuzhan Vong hadn't just attacked her home. They had erased her future. And in that moment, that still, breathless moment, something inside Jacen collapsed. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just felt the quiet crack, like the sound of glass breaking beneath too much weight. This wasn't about the Force anymore. It wasn't about balance or teachings or destinies. It was about children who no longer had names, families that no longer had graves, planets that no longer had histories, and a Jedi Order that no longer had answers. The girl lived, they got her off-world, but Jacen didn't remember her name. He didn't ask, because he knew whether she lived another year or another decade. The galaxy had already taken something from her it would never return. And the Force had let it happen. That was the thought he couldn't escape. He'd been raised to believe the Force was balance, that it guided the natural flow of life, that through discipline and compassion, Jedi could align themselves with that current. But this wasn't set balance. This was chaos and death and silence, stretched over thousands of systems. And the Force had not intervened. That night, Jacen stood on the edge of the refugee ship's viewport, staring into the dark. Stars passed slowly across the glass, systems still untouched, still ignorant. He asked himself a question. Not aloud. Not even with words. It was more like a feeling, one that had been building since the first body he couldn't save. What if they set all wrong? Not just the Jedi, the Sith, the philosophies, the codes, all of it. What if none of them understood what the Force truly was? And worse, what if they did and were too afraid to say it? That it didn't sit there, that it never had. That it was simply motion, energy, power, nothing more. He didn't want to believe that. But the belief he'd been holding on to, the one that said love, empathy, and peace were enough, had crumbled. Not in rage, not in betrayal, in heartbreak. The next morning, Jacen rejoined the mission like nothing had happened, gave the reports, attended the briefings, smiled when someone nodded at him in the hallway. But inside, he knew he hadn't just felt something break. He had watched it break, slowly, completely, and had done nothing to stop it. Because maybe it needed to break, so something else could take its place. And whatever that something was, Jacen had already started looking for it. Jacen had always known pain. The Jedi taught him how to quiet it, how to let it pass through him like wind through a canyon, how to breathe beneath it. But what the Jedi never taught, what they couldn't teach, was how to survive pain that didn't come from wounds. Because the Yuuzhan Vong didn't just break his body, they unmade his sense of self. He was taken during a mission gone wrong, a capture, not a kill. It was intentional. They wanted him alive, not because he was a Solo, not because he was strong, but because they were curious. What would a Jedi do when stripped of everything that made him Jedi? There was no light in the cell, no sound, no force, no frame of reference. Time dissolved. And in that absence, Jacen realized something. The cage wasn't the walls. It was him. His training, his beliefs, his identity, they all became questions. Not because the Vong asked them, but because silence left space for doubt. He didn't know how long it lasted. The pain came in cycles, physical at first, nerve hooks, biotech needles, chemicals that burned through tissue and memory, but then came the words from Vergere. She didn't look like a torturer, her voice was soft, her steps light, but every question she asked felt like a knife sliding under the surface. What do you fear, Jacen? What part of yourself are you clinging to? What if everything you believe is just a cage made from someone else's fear? She didn't scream at him, didn't demand answers. She simply waited, let the silence grow. And Jacen, tired, broken, hungry, began to answer. Not because he wanted to, but because part of him already had the questions inside. Was he good because of the code, or because he was afraid of what he might become without it? Was the Force guiding him, or was he following it because he couldn't bear the thought of being wrong? Was pain evil? Or was it the only thing that had ever been completely honest with him? These weren't the questions of a Jedi. And Jacen knew it. But inside that cell, the line between Jedi and prisoner blurred, between thought and belief, between truth and fear. He wanted to escape. He wanted the Force to return and flood him with purpose. But it didn't sit. And that silence, that absence, was worse than pain, because it forced him to face the possibility that the Force had never been what he thought it was. And maybe he hadn't sit either. The Jedi taught that pain should be observed, not absorbed. To feel it, acknowledge it, and then release it into the Force. But in the cells of the Yuuzhan Vong, there was no force, no release, just the endless repetition of agony, not to extract information, not to punish, but to watch what pain would do. They didn't ask questions, they didn't need secrets. What they wanted was transformation. Jacen didn't understand it at first. He thought it was madness, the ramblings of a culture that worshipped suffering for its own sake. But the longer it went on, the clearer it became. The Vong believed pain was holy, that only through destruction could someone be made pure. And so they didn't just hurt him. They stripped him, his name, his past, his purpose. Every day, they returned him to nothing. And in that nothing, Jacen began to see the outlines of something else. Not clarity, not enlightenment, just a kind of freedom. Because when the Force was silent, and the pain didn't stop, and there were no Jedi lessons to fall back on, there was only choice. Not between light and dark, not between right and wrong, just the choice to endure or to break. Vergere visited him during these moments. Her presence was quiet, unsettling. She never offered comfort, only ideas. She spoke of truths beyond the code, that pain reveals identity, that suffering is not the enemy, ignorance is. She told Jacen that he was not a Jedi. Not really. He was a shadow of one. A child clinging to stories, unable to see the truth in front of him, that the Force is not good or evil. It simply is. And those who try to shape it into a moral weapon are lying to themselves and to the galaxy. At first, Jacen rejected her. Even in agony, he held on to what the Jedi taught him. But Vergere didn't stay to argue. She waited, and as the hours blurred, Jacen found himself wondering, what if she was right? What if pain wasn't something to escape, but something to learn from? What if his suffering was not a punishment, but a lesson? And more dangerously, what if that lesson made more sense than anything the Jedi had ever told him? There were moments he hated himself for thinking it. Moments he remembered Anakin's face, Jaina's voice, his mother's embrace. But those memories grew distant. Not because he let them go, but because pain crowded them out. The kind of pain that leaves no room for anything else. He began to feel numb, not in body, in soul. And in that numbness, he found stillness. He wasn't afraid anymore. Not because he was strong, but because there was nothing left to fear. Not death, not failure. Not even becoming something the Jedi would no longer recognize. And in that stillness, Vergere said 3 words that never left him. You are free. Freedom wasn't what Jacen expected. He thought it would feel like escape, a breaking of chains, a breath of air after drowning. But this was different. It was quieter, stranger, like walking through a door he hadn't known was there. And on the other side, nothing. Not purpose, not peace, just space. It frightened him at first. Not because it was dark, but because he realized the teachings he'd built his life around had no meaning here. The Jedi Code didn't explain pain that served no justice. Compassion didn't survive when survival meant choosing who not to save. Even the light side of the Force, distant, quiet, pure, had nothing to say in this place. And so Jacen listened to the only voice that still spoke to him, Vergere. She never told him what to believe. She only asked questions, and slowly he began to answer. Not to please her, not to agree, but because her questions wouldn't stop echoing. Why do you obey? Why do you fear power? What if the Force is not your master, but your mirror? They weren't lessons. They were reflections, held up against everything he had once called true. Vergere told him the Force had no sides, that the dark and the light were just names for emotions Jedi feared. That fear itself was a chain. Jacen didn't argue anymore, because somewhere deep inside, he understood he had never truly been free, not from his lineage, not from the Order, not even from himself. His life had always been shaped by expectation, to be a Solo, to be a Jedi, to be calm, gentle, wise, restrained. But what if that wasn't Sith who he was? What if that was who he had been trained to be? He remembered standing before the council years ago, speaking carefully, questioning gently, always afraid to push too far. He remembered Luke's eyes, kind but burdened, always waiting for the next mistake. He remembered the war, the screams, the weight of every life he couldn't seize. And now, in this cage, stripped of robes and rank and name, he felt something honest. Not pride, not rage, a quiet clarity. That maybe the Jedi weren't wrong, but they weren't complete. They spoke of balance, but feared the emotions that made balance necessary. They warned of power, but never questioned their own authority. They chased peace, but never asked whether that peace came at the cost of truth. And Vergere, she didn't set off her answers. She offered choice. Pain is a tool, she said. So is love. So is fear. So is the Force. Jacen had been taught to let the Force guide him. But now, he wondered if the Force was waiting for him to choose what it meant. This wasn't Sith to fall. Not yet. This was something else. Something the Jedi never taught him. That clarity doesn't come from silence. It comes from standing in the middle of pain and choosing what comes next. Not because the code says so. Not because tradition demands it. But because you decide. And in that decision, something inside Jacen changed. Jacen was eventually freed. Not by escape, not by rescue, but by release. The Yuuzhan Vong had no more use for him. Vergere claimed it was part of his test. That survival meant transformation, and transformation meant freedom. Whatever it was, the cage opened. But he didn't set run. He walked out, slowly, quietly. Like a man who no longer feared what was behind him or ahead. When he rejoined the Jedi, he said little. They welcomed him back like a lost son. Relief in their voices, worry in their eyes. But none of them asked what really happened. Not because they didn't want to know, because they could already sense it. Something in him had shifted. He smiled, he reassured, he re-entered training, but the boy who once doubted quietly was gone. Now his silence held something heavier, something the others couldn't name. Only Vergere could. And though she wasn't with him anymore, her voice stayed. In the quiet moments it whispered. In the Force it lingered. He would stand before the council and hear it. What do they fear in you? He would spar with Jaina and remember, you are not your twin. He would watch Luke struggle under the weight of leadership and wonder, who told you there must be only one way? Vergere had planted seeds, not commands, not ideology, but permission to question, to disobey, to become. And Jacen knew it would never leave him. Because once you've broken beneath the weight of who you were supposed to be, there's no going back. He began to study alone. New techniques, lost lore, not forbidden, but rarely explored. He read about the Force in ways the Jedi didn't teach. He examined emotions instead of suppressing them. He meditated not to empty himself, but to listen to what was still buried inside. His fellow Jedi began to notice. Some called him wiser. Others called him distant. They were both right, because Jacen no longer saw the world in sides. He saw it in patterns, in choices, in causes. The war hadn't ended. The Yuuzhan Vong still advanced. People still died, but Jacen no longer felt paralyzed by the pain. He still felt it, but now he carried it with purpose. The way a blade carries weight, the way silence carries truth. He didn't become cold. He became careful, deliberate, unshaken by the fear that had once ruled him. And that voice, soft, foreign, familiar, remained, not as command, not as control. As a reminder that when the Jedi called him back from the edge, he had already stepped over it. But he hadn't fallen. He had chosen. And someday he knew that choice would lead him down a path the others wouldn't follow, a path they might never understand. He didn't know what that path was yet, but he felt it waiting. And when he finally reached it, when the moment came to act, not just reflect, he would not hesitate. Because Jacen Solo had been a Jedi, and now he was becoming something else. Not darker, not lighter, just different. And the galaxy wouldn't understand it, until it was too late. Vergere didn't introduce herself with authority. She didn't claim the title of Jedi or Sith or anything at all. She simply appeared, in the dark, in the pain, and spoke softly, like someone who had always been there, waiting for Jacen to finally listen. She never called herself his master, but Jacen understood, eventually, that's what she was. Not in the way he'd known before, not the way Luke had taught or the Jedi Council had instructed. Vergere didn't give answers, she gave silence, and within that silence, she planted questions, ones that would never stop growing. She didn't save him from the Yuuzhan Vong, she kept him there. Because she believed that pain wasn't something to flee, it was something to pass through and emerge from, changed. At first, Jacen resisted. Even after the worst of the physical torment had stopped, even when the cell was no longer locked, his mind was still curled inward, clinging to the last pieces of identity he understood. He was a Jedi. He followed the code. He believed in the light. But Vergere didn't tear those ideas down. She let him hold them, gently, like glassware already cracked. She just waited for his own questions to shatter them. She spoke in riddles. She asked what he feared. She asked who he was. And when he recited the answers the Jedi had taught him, she didn't argue. She only asked, did you choose that truth, or were you told it? Jacen wanted to hate her for what she did, for standing beside his tormentors, for offering no comfort, no hope. But even his anger began to shift, because Vergere didn't act out of cruelty. She acted like someone who had once asked the same questions and never stopped. And slowly, Jacen began to see her not as his captor, but as his reflection. She never pushed, she guided. When he cried, she sat with him. When he lashed out, she didn't flinch. And when he finally stopped resisting, not in defeat, but in exhaustion, she told him something that stayed with him for the rest of his life. You are not a Jedi, you are not a Sith, you are a student, and the lesson never ends. That lesson wasn't about power, or destiny, or salvation. It was about choice. Jacen had been raised to obey. Even when questioning, even when doubting, he had always followed someone else's path. Luke's, his parents, the Council's. But Vergere didn't want obedience. She wanted awareness. Of pain. Of fear. Of the Force. Of himself. She taught him to sit with his emotions instead of hiding them, to hold them in his hands and ask where they came from, not to judge them, not to justify them, to see them. And in seeing them, to understand the only real power he would ever have. The power to choose what they meant. By the time his body healed, Jacen no longer looked to the Force for comfort. He no longer searched for light or dark. He searched for clarity. And Vergere, the master without a name, had given him that. Not by giving him truth, but by forcing him to find his own. Vergere never told Jacen to abandon the light. She didn't speak in absolutes. She didn't tell him what was wrong with the Jedi, only ask whether he had ever truly understood them, whether he had ever questioned why their path demanded so much silence, why their code meant to bring peace so often left people numb. He tried at first to hold on to it, to believe that compassion meant detachment, that serenity meant surrender, that love, while dangerous, was something he could live without. But the war had already broken those beliefs. The pain had stripped them bare, and now Vergere was pulling at the threads that remained, not to destroy them, but to show him what lay beneath. She spoke of the Force not as light or dark, but as raw potential, as life itself, unbound, untamed, neither cruel nor kind. It moved. It responded. It revealed, and it waited for those strong enough to stop clinging to the illusion of control. Jacen had always believed morality was part of the Force, that it guided him through feeling, through empathy, through instinct. But what if the Force didn't care what he felt? What if it only cared what he chose? That was the most dangerous part of Vergere's lesson. She didn't offer an escape from pain. She made him sit in it, think through it, trace it back to its roots. And when he finally stopped trying to make sense of what the Jedi had taught, when he stopped trying to bend his feelings to match their expectations, he saw something he wasn't ready for. He wasn't suffering because he had failed. He was suffering because he had believed that pain meant failure. The Jedi had taught him to fear emotion, to fear attachment, to fear losing himself. But Vergere taught him something else, that fear was not a warning, it was a mirror. One that showed him what he wasn't ready to accept. That sometimes, the Jedi path didn't save people, it silenced them. And in that silence, good people died. Jacen remembered the faces, the ones he couldn't save, the ones he wasn't allowed to save, the the ones whose lives were measured against strategy, politics, consequence. The Jedi had told him he couldn't save everyone. Vergere asked him why he ever believed he had to follow their rules in trying. And in that space between belief and doubt, something old began to slip away. Not his love for the Jedi, not his loyalty to the Order, but the part of him that had once believed he needed their permission to be right. He started meditating differently. He let himself feel without resisting it. He didn't push sorrow aside, he explored it. He didn't avoid anger, he followed it to its source. And each time he came back not smaller, but sharper. Not lost, but clearer. Vergere told him that truth was not found in peace. Truth was found when peace no longer protected you. And Jacen, once the quiet one, the soft one, the hopeful one, began to see that the peace he had chased for so long had only hidden what was broken underneath. He wasn't abandoning the light, he was unlearning its rules. Because sometimes, the rules were the problem. And someone had to say so, even if no one was ready to listen. There's a kind of silence that doesn't bring calm. It waits, watches, reflects everything you've spent your life trying to ignore. That was the silence Jacen found himself in. Long after the beatings stopped, long after Vergere's questions grew fewer, the cell was still his world. But now it was filled with nothing but him. His choices, his memories, his fears. And in that stillness, Vergere handed him a mirror. Not literal, not physical, but real all the same. She asked him not to look for truth. She asked him to see. What had he become when no one was watching? Who was he when no title, no robes, no teachings remained? He tried at first to hold on to the idea that this was temporary, that he was still a Jedi, still himself. That when he escaped, because part of him still believed he would, he'd return to the Order with insight, with strength. But that mirror didn't reflect a Jedi anymore. It reflected someone else. Someone who had changed not just because of pain, but because of what pain revealed. He began to see the layers, the compromises, the soft lies he had wrapped around himself since childhood. The belief that obedience meant safety, that understanding meant control, that compassion could exist without consequence. And deeper still, he saw the truth the Jedi never prepared him for, that you could follow every rule and still lose yourself. That the Force didn't protect you from grief, that it didn't make you good, that it didn't give answers, only presence. The mirror showed him the moment he watched Anakin die, the moment he killed to save others, the moment he hesitated and people died because of it. He used to think those moments defined his failure. Now, he saw them for what they really were. Truth. Raw, heavy, without comfort. Vergere told him the Jedi would never understand what he had seen, that they would welcome him back with kind words and cautious eyes, that they would ask for reports, not realizations, that they would treat his survival as a return to form, not a transformation. And she was right. Because even Jacen knew when he returned, he wouldn't be able to tell them what really happened, not in words, not in any way they would understand. They still believed the mirror was the code, that the reflection they saw in it was the only one that mattered. But Jacen had looked into something deeper, something that didn't show him what he was taught to be, something that showed him what he was when all the teachings fell away. It didn't set to make him proud. It didn't set to make him ashamed. It made him aware. He would never be the same again. And more than that, he didn't want to be. Because for the first time in his life, Jacen wasn't walking someone else's path. He wasn't echoing lessons or imitating masters. He was making choices. Uncertain, imperfect, real. And that terrified him, not because he feared being wrong, but because he knew he could never go back. Vergere didn't say goodbye when the time came. She simply stopped speaking, because her lesson was complete. Not because Jacen had found clarity, but because he'd finally stopped pretending that clarity was ever the goal. He didn't need the Jedi to forgive him. He didn't need the galaxy to understand him. He had seen the mirror. He had held it long enough. And now, it was time to walk away. They welcomed him back with quiet relief. No celebration, no questions too sharp, just handshakes, embraces, and eyes that couldn't stop watching him when they thought he wouldn't notice. The Jedi had lost so much in the war, and now one of their own had returned from the dead. Jacen smiled for them. He spoke gently. He said the right things, but everything about him had changed. They called him stronger, wiser, more mature, And maybe he was, but underneath their praise was something else, something none of them said aloud. Jacen didn't feel like a Jedi anymore, and they could sense it. The way he moved, the way he listened more than he spoke, the way he answered questions with more questions. There was no anger, no resistance, just a stillness they didn't know what to do with. Luke tried to reach him, took him aside, asked how he had survived, what had happened, what he had learned. Jacen gave him half-truths, that he had endured, that he had seen pain, that he had come back with new perspective. But he didn't speak Vergere Sith's name. He didn't speak about the mirror, all the questions still echoing inside him, because he knew Luke wasn't ready to hear those answers. Not yet. Jacen joined missions again, taught students, walked the halls of the Praxium with a quiet grace, but everything he did with a sense of distance, like someone navigating a dream he no longer believed in. The other Jedi respected him, but they didn't understand him. Not when he questioned their tactics in war. Not when he refused to condemn the decisions of others, even when they went against the code. Not when he sat silently during debates, as if the outcome had already been decided, not by votes but by consequence. He wasn't cruel, but he was different, and that difference unsettled them. Because Jacen no longer treated the code like scripture. He treated it like a tool, useful but not sacred. And that meant the Jedi couldn't predict him anymore. They wanted to believe he had healed, that the pain had passed, that the boy they remembered had come back. But he hadn't set. The boy was gone. In his place stood someone who had seen what lay beneath the teachings and chose to walk forward anyway, not as a student, but as a seeker. He still helped, still saved lives, still protected. But his compass no longer pointed toward light or dark. It pointed toward understanding. And sometimes that meant walking paths the Jedi wouldn't take. He began spending time alone, reading texts the Order had forgotten, studying Force philosophies not bound to tradition, questioning not just what the Jedi believed, but why they believed it. And with each question he moved further from the center. Not because he wanted to rebel, but because the center no longer felt honest. The war didn't stop for him. It raged on. And Jacen adapted. He made choices no Jedi should make, but he made them anyway. Not for power, not for glory, for peace. A peace he had seen once, not in a vision, but in the silence that followed surrender. The kind of peace that required sacrifice, the kind that the Jedi feared to name. And slowly Jacen realized something he couldn't ignore. The galaxy didn't need another Jedi. It needed something else. Someone else. Someone willing to make the choice others refused. Even if it meant being remembered as wrong. Even if it meant losing everything. Even if it meant becoming what the Jedi feared. Because in the end, Jacen didn't return as the man they lost. He returned as the man they wouldn't recognize. And the path ahead was already waiting for him. He loved her. That much was never in question. Jacen didn't say it often. He didn't have to. The way he stood beside Tenel Kara, the way his voice softened when speaking to her, the way he shielded her from the noise of the galaxy, it was all love, but it wasn't open, it wasn't free. Because love, to Jacen, had stopped being something you shared, it had become something you protected. They kept it secret, not just because of her political standing on Hapes, not just because of duty, but because somewhere deep down Jacen had learned to fear what would happen if others saw what made him human. He had seen what love cost his grandfather. He had seen how the Jedi weighed attachment against duty. And he had lived through a war where every feeling became a liability. So when Alana was born, Jacen didn't tell anyone, not even his family, not even Jaina. He smiled when he held her. A real smile, soft and full of awe. But even that smile, the one meant for his daughter, didn't stay long. Because peace had returned, but only on paper. The war was over, but the galaxy was tense, fractured, slipping again toward unrest. And Jacen had already learned what happened when Jedi waited too long to act. So he made a choice. To become the one who would prevent the next war before it started, to watch everything, question everything, intervene if necessary. Even if it meant stepping outside the shadows he once stood in. Even if it meant becoming something unrecognizable to the ones who loved him. Tenel Ka saw the change. She never spoke against it, never tried to stop him, but she looked at him differently, not with fear, but with sadness. Because she understood something Jacen didn't yet. That every time he smiled now, it was no longer for her. It was for the future he thought he was protecting. Even if that future never arrived. Even if he had to vanish to build it. Ben Skywalker trusted him. Not just because Jacen was family, not just because Luke had placed that trust in him, but because Jacen never raised his voice, never made Ben feel small. He explained things gently, listened, even when Ben didn't know how to ask the right question. To Ben, Jacen was the Jedi he wanted to become, strong but calm, brave but kind. And Jacen never told him otherwise. He smiled when Ben spoke, nodded when Ben asked about the Force, guided him through exercises with patience that felt limitless. But what Ben didn't see, what no one did, was that Jacen had already stopped believing in the things he was teaching. He still spoke of the code, still explained the difference between light and dark, still reminded Ben to breathe, to listen, to trust. But the words felt distant, like echoes of a person Jacen used to be. He wasn't lying. He was protecting. Not Ben. Not really. He was protecting the boy he had once been, the one who trusted Luke, the one who believed every lesson had meaning, the one who thought knowledge alone could prevent loss. Ben Tep's innocence wasn't set a flaw. It was a reminder of how far Jacen had come and how far he had already decided to go. There were moments when Ben would ask something simple. Why do some people never come back from war? Or, is the dark side always evil? Jacen would pause. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he did. And the truth he now lived by, wasn't something Ben was ready to hear. Not yet. So he gave him the Jedi answers. The safe ones. The ones that had once helped Jacen sleep at night, before the answers started to unravel. Ben smiled, accepted them, moved on. And Jacen would watch him walk away with a strange ache in his chest. Because he loved that boy like a brother, like a student, like a version of himself that still believed in simple answers. And he knew what was coming. He knew Ben would grow. He knew questions would return. And one day, Ben would see what Jacen had seen, that peace built on tradition was too fragile to last. That sometimes, truth and control looked the same, that the Force didn't always reward those who waited. Jacen hoped that when that day came, Ben wouldn't hate him for the silence. Because the words he didn't say were his way of holding on to the last part of himself that hadn't yet crossed the line. He felt it coming before anyone else said the word. Not through visions, not through the Force, just through patterns, in politics, in fear, in how fast people began to take sides over questions that hadn't mattered a year before. Jacen saw how quickly peace thinned, how easily hope gave way to suspicion. The Second Galactic Civil War didn't explode, it unraveled. And when it did, Jacen didn't flinch. He didn't argue for diplomacy, he didn't warn the Council, he didn't hesitate, he stepped forward, not as a Jedi following orders, but as someone who had already decided that waiting meant losing more than just battles. It meant losing futures. He told himself it was necessary. The galaxy couldn't survive another war like the last one. It needed direction, stability, precision. And Jacen knew he could offer that. Not with speeches, with action. He took command when others argued, made decisions while the Council debated. People followed him, not because of fear, not yet, but because he was confident, calm, unshaken by the panic spreading around him. He still wore the robes, still spoke like a Jedi. But behind his voice was a logic colder than any code. He knew where this would lead. And that's why he didn't resist it. Because he had already made peace with what he would have to become to stop it. There was no excitement in his eyes, no hunger for power, just a steady, unbreakable belief that only someone willing to control the galaxy could save it from itself. To most, it looked like leadership. To Jacen, it felt like sacrifice. He began operating alone more often, pushing beyond what the Council allowed, eliminating threats before they became visible, making alliances not with the strongest, but with the most predictable. He wasn't chasing victory. He was managing inevitability. Because the truth was, Jacen had already accepted that the Jedi couldn't hold the galaxy together. They were too slow, too careful, too bound by principles that worked in peacetime and collapsed in war. He didn't blame them. He had loved them once. But love couldn't stop what was coming. Control could. And that meant doing what they couldn't. even if it meant giving up the last parts of himself that still believed in peace as something you waited for. Because Jacen no longer waited, he moved. He chose, and every step he took knowing that one day no one would remember him as the Jedi who tried to stop another war. They'd remember him as the man who started one to end it. He stopped believing in peace the day he realized it was always temporary. Every treaty, every ceasefire, every political promise made in good faith, they all came with quiet expiration dates. Not written in ink, but carved into fear. The fear that something would go wrong again, that someone else would rise, that another war would return. And it always did. Jacen had spent his entire life watching it happen. First as a learner, then as a warrior, then as a witness. He had seen too much to pretend anymore. And so, when the galaxy slowed, when battles paused and leaders shook hands, Jacen didn't feel relief. He felt urgency, because that kind of peace wasn't Sith but real. It was the space between storms, a silence mistaken for safety, and this time he wouldn't be caught off guard. He would build a peace that lasted not because people believed in it, but because they had no other choice. That was the difference. The peace Jacen envisioned didn't come from trust. It came from certainty, predictability, control. He would root out chaos before it could take form, shape governments before they crumbled, eliminate instability, even if it meant eliminating people. To others, it looked harsh. To Jacen, it looked honest. He kept smiling, kept teaching, kept holding Alana in moments no one could see. But even then, even with her tiny hands in his, the thought never left him, that she would never be safe in a galaxy built on good intentions. She needed more than hope. She needed a future no one could tear apart, and Jacen was the only one willing to build it. He knew what it would cost him. He knew what the Jedi would say, what his family would feel, what the history books would write. But he also knew something else, something they couldn't sit to admit, that every generation of Jedi had failed to stop what came next, because they trusted peace. Jacen no longer did. He watched the galaxy sleep, unaware that cracks were already forming beneath it. And he told himself, quietly, firmly, when it breaks again, it won't sit be because I waited. It didn't sit feel like destiny. It felt like pressure, quiet, slow, building in the back of his mind long before he stood beneath that temple, before Nalani Din, before the visions. It wasn't fate that brought Jacen there, it was consequence, the weight of choices left unmade for too long. He had seen it once before, a flash, distant but real, a galaxy torn apart, billions dead, civil war spreading through systems like wildfire, all because of something that had not happened, yet. He didn't understand it at first. Then he saw her. Nilani. She was loyal, thoughtful, brave. She believed in the Jedi, believed in him, trusted him. And that made what came next impossible. Because Jacen had seen what her survival meant. Not directly, not in prophecy, but in possibility. A line of events spreading outward, branching into chaos. If she lived, the galaxy would die. It sounded absurd, it felt cruel, but the Force didn't show him lies. And Jacen had already learned what happened when Jedi hesitated in the name of mercy. So he stood beneath the dark temple on Vergere, shadows moving around him like breath. Lamia's voice echoing with temptation, the past pressing in on all sides. And in the middle of it, Nalani, asking him to come back, asking him to choose the light. She wasn't begging, she wasn't afraid, she believed he would do the right thing. That belief made it worse. Because Jacen knew he was about to kill someone who had never hurt him, someone who would have followed him into danger, someone who wanted to save him. And he wasn't doing it out of hatred. He was doing it because he believed the alternative was worse. He didn't explain, didn't argue, didn't try to change her mind. Because Jacen had already changed his. This wasn't a fall. It was a decision. Not made in anger, not clouded by fear. Made with clarity. The kind Vergere had taught him to find. He told himself this would save lives. That he would carry the cost so no one else had to. But even then, there was a voice in the back of his mind that asked, what if the vision lied? What if you were wrong? What if this is the moment the galaxy loses you? He silenced it. Not with certainty. With necessity. Because Jacen no longer believed peace was something you hoped for. It was something you built, with hard choices, with quiet sins, with actions no one else would take, not because they were evil, but because they were unbearable. Nilani stepped toward him, her face calm, still believing, still hoping. And Jacen realized this wasn't just about her. This was about the kind of man he would have to become. The kind of protector the galaxy didn't want, but might one day thank. So he drew his weapon. Not fast, not with anger. And in that moment, that slow, breathless moment, he became something else. Not a Jedi, not yet a Sith. Just a man standing between two futures, and choosing the one no one else was willing to carry. She didn't run. Nilani Din could have reached for her saber. She could have fought. She could have shouted, tried to call him back with anger or fear, but she didn't. She just looked at him. And in that look, still, quiet, unblinking, Jacen saw something that would stay with him long after her body was gone. She didn't hate him. She didn't even question him. She just stood there, her presence full of faith. Faith in him. Faith that he would make the right choice. That whatever the Force had shown him, he would find another way. But there was no other way. Jacen had already searched for it. Every possible turn, every compromise, every thread he could pull to redirect the outcome, and each one led to the same place. War, death, collapse. He didn't want to kill her. He had wanted her to walk away, to forget what she saw, to let him carry this burden alone. But she wouldn't. She was a Jedi, and she believed in justice. She believed in truth, and Jacen no longer did. Not in the old sense, not in the way the Order defined it. Because he had seen what truth looked like in war. It looked like grief, it looked like failure, it looked like survivors standing in rubble, holding nothing but principles that hadn't saved them. So when Nilani refused to leave, when she chose duty over trust, Jacen saw only one future left. He warned her. One last time. She didn't flinch. Didn't plead. She simply said, then do what you think you must. And that was when he knew. She wasn't afraid. She knew she was going to die. And still, she never looked at him with hatred. Only sadness. Not for herself. For him. Because she understood, in her final seconds, that whatever he was becoming, it wasn't out of malice. It was out of belief. Belief that the cost of peace had to be paid now by someone before the galaxy burned again. And Jacen had chosen to be the one to pay it. He moved quickly, not violently. Her body collapsed without sound. The Force didn't scream. It simply shifted, like a current taking a new direction, quiet and irreversible. Jacen stood over her for a long time. He didn't cry. Didn't tremble. He just breathed. Slowly, deeply. As if anchoring himself to the moment, to make sure he never forgot what it felt like to trade a life for the illusion of order. Because this wasn't victory. It wasn't sacrifice. It was a mark. A line he had crossed and could never return from. Not because anyone saw. No one did. Not because he would be punished. He wouldn't but because he had looked into the eyes of someone who believed in him, right up until the last second, and killed them anyway. Not to silence them, to stop what they might cause. That was the part that would never leave him. Not the act, the reason, and the fact that, even now, even as he stepped away from her body, he still believed it was right. It was never loud. There was no explosion, no outcry, no storm in the Force. Just stillness. After Nilani fell, the galaxy didn't shift, the stars didn't dim, the temple didn't crumble, nothing changed, and yet everything did. Jacen stood there, waiting for something. Maybe judgment, maybe guilt, maybe the Force itself would recoil, pull away from him, mark him as fallen. But it didn't The Force was quiet, present, unmoved. And in that silence, Jacen heard something else. His own breath. Steady, measured. He hadn't even realized he'd been holding it. He looked at his hands. They weren't shaking. And that scared him more than anything else. Because he had crossed a line, one the Jedi said could never be uncrossed. One the Order had warned about for generations. But it didn't feel like darkness. It didn't feel like corruption. It felt calm. That was the moment Jacen understood what true commitment felt like. Not rage, not triumph. Stillness. The kind that came when doubt was finally quiet, when fear had nothing left to say, when a decision became part of who you were. He left her body where it fell. Not out of cruelty, not out of disrespect, but because there was no gesture that could make it right, no ritual, no apology, and because, in his heart, he believed her death was not an end, but a pivot, a necessity, a moment that would stop something worse. That belief didn't soothe him. It settled him, like a weight finally placed in the right spot. He walked out of the temple without looking back. Lumia waited for him, not with triumph, not with celebration, but with understanding. She said nothing at first. Then only one thing. You chose. He didn't answer, because he knew now that words didn't matter, only outcomes. And the outcome Jacen saw, the one burned into his memory, was a galaxy spared from burning because of what he'd done here. He couldn't explain it to Luke. He couldn't explain it to Tenel Ka. He couldn't explain it to himself, not in language, only in silence. That deep, unsettling silence that comes after something irreversible. And yet, there was a sound within it, faint but steady. A quiet shift, not in the Force, in Jacen. He had always been surrounded by voices, teachers, siblings, masters, students, expectations. Now for the first time, there was only one voice left, his own. And it was no longer asking why. It was asking what next. Because peace, real peace, required more than just intention. It required certainty, sacrifice, control. And Jacen had taken the first step toward becoming someone the galaxy could fear, so it wouldn't have to fear anything else. He didn't smile, didn't grieve. He moved forward, the temple growing smaller behind him. And somewhere far away, the future shifted. Not because he saved it, because he reshaped it. With silence. With purpose. With one choice the Jedi would never forgive. And one he would never apologize for. It didn't happen like in the stories. There was no armor waiting for him. No ritual. No Sith holocron glowing red in the shadows. The transformation wasn't physical. It was a silence that stretched long enough for a name to disappear. Jacen Solo walked into the shadows of the Force. And something else walked out. Not with hatred. With resolve. He didn't claim the title of Sith out of pride. He didn't declare himself a Dark Lord with thunder in his voice. It wasn't like that. It was quieter, private. He let the name Jacen fall behind him, because that name could still be reasoned with. That name still hesitated. The one who remained would not. Darth Caedus didn't come to life all at once. He didn't arrive in a blaze of violence. He formed in the space Jacen left behind, in the choices that couldn't be undone, in the silences that couldn't be filled. Because Jacen had always wanted peace, but Caedus was willing to be hated for it. He started to move differently, not in posture, but in energy. People around him noticed, even if they couldn't name it. His voice carried weight now, not because it was louder, because it didn't carry doubt. To Ben Skywalker, he was still a teacher, but the lessons began to feel colder, sharper. To Tenel Ka, he was still the father of her child, but his smile lingered less. His touch didn't warm the air like before. To the Jedi, he was still one of them, but the Force around him pulsed strangely, like something was folding in on itself. And Jacen let them believe it. Because in his mind, the only thing worse than becoming something they feared was letting the future he'd seen come true. He saps kill again. He already knew that. He sept make enemies. He already had. But the pain didn't matter. The loneliness didn't matter. The cost didn't matter. Because Jacen wasn't fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting against the future. A future that would crush Ben, that would destroy Alana, that would burn the Jedi Order and leave the galaxy in ashes. And if becoming Caedus, if being seen as a tyrant, a traitor, a monster, was the price of stopping that, then so be it. He still had memories of who he was. He still remembered Anakin's laugh, Jaina's strength, Luke's voice, his mother's belief in him. But those were pieces of a life he could no longer protect as Jacen. Because Jacen would hesitate. Jacen would ask permission. Caedus would not. He stood on the edge of something, not darkness, not light, but the cold necessity between them. And when he crossed it, no one stopped him, because no one knew yet what he had become. But he did. He had stepped away from being a man with questions, and become a man with only one answer. I will do what must be done. No matter who bled, no matter who remembered him with hatred, even if no one remembered him at all. He didn't argue with the name. There was no ceremony, no crowd, no shadowed figures in black robes reciting ancient words, just Lemua's voice, steady, calm, certain. She said it like she'd known it all along, like the galaxy had just been waiting for Jacen Solo to become what it always knew he would be. Darth Caedus. It didn't strike like thunder. It settled, like a stone at the bottom of a lake. The ripples were slow, quiet, barely noticed, until everything else began to shift. He didn't flinch when he heard it. He didn't hesitate either, because by then he had already let go of the last pieces of himself. Not in rage, not in fear, but in something colder, something sharper, a calculation. For months, the future had been pressing into his mind like a wound that wouldn't close. Visions stacking on top of each other, screams he hadn't yet caused, wars he hadn't yet started, deaths he could still prevent, but only if he acted before the galaxy knew it needed saving. Becoming a Sith wasn't the goal, it was the consequence. He told himself that, again and again, because that made it sound like a price, and prices can be justified, even when they can't be forgiven. The name Caedus came with no promise of power, only responsibility. He would not wear black robes or breathe in mechanical gasps. He would not sit on a throne. His empire would be built in the shadows, not for glory, but for order, because peace built in daylight was always fragile. He remembered something his uncle once told him. Every victory in war is temporary, only peace lasts. But Jacen had seen too much to believe that now peace, in his eyes, had become a performance, managed by fragile treaties, held up by men afraid to act, Jedi councils that deliberated while systems burned, diplomats who smiled while planning new betrayals. He would not be that kind of leader. He would be the kind that never needed to ask for peace, because no one would dare to disrupt it. He stood in silence after Lumia named him, not because he was unsure, but because he felt the moment sealing around him like a tomb. There would be no turning back, no undoing it, no version of Jacen Solo that could survive what came next. But there was something else too. Relief. He no longer had to explain, not to Luke, not to Tenel Cad, not to Ben, not even to himself. The path was brutal, but it was clear. And clarity had always been the rarest thing in the Force. He looked at Lumia, the last living remnant of an empire that failed, and he didn't see a master, he saw a witness. Someone to record the moment he stopped pretending. Someone who would not flinch when he made the galaxy afraid of him. Because fear was honest. And maybe in time, honesty could protect the ones he loved better than hope ever did. The Force didn't scream in protest. It didn't tear him apart. It didn't strike him down. It simply went quiet. As if even it was holding its breath. As if it too was waiting to see whether Darth Caedus would become the monster the galaxy feared, or the shield it didn't know it needed. The first person he saw after the naming wasn't an enemy, it was Ben. A boy, a student, a shadow that had followed him for years, not because he was commanded to, but because he trusted Jacen, trusted his guidance, trusted that behind the quiet voice and patient words was someone who still believed in the Jedi. Jacen didn't correct him. He let Ben believe it. Even now, as the Force around them shifted, as the light retreated from Jacen like water pulled from a sinking stone, he still spoke with the same calm tone. "You start doing well," he said. Ben smiled, trying to mask his confusion. He could feel it, not in words, but in the way Jacen's presence felt thinner, less warm, like talking through a wall of glass. Ben asked about Lumia. He asked if she could be trusted, if she was really helping them stop the future Jacen had warned about. Jacen didn't answer the question. Not directly, he said only what Ben needed to hear to keep walking forward, one step at a time, just like he had done. It wasn't deception, it was mercy. Because explaining the truth would destroy him, and Ben had so much left to learn, so many ideals to hold on to before the galaxy made him let them go. Jacen remembered what it was like to believe you were saving people just by surviving. He remembered thinking the Force had a plan, and that it chose him to carry it. But that illusion cracked the day he saw peace negotiated by compromise, not conviction. When he saw that the Jedi had become more comfortable with balance than action. He couldn't explain all that to Ben, because if he did, Ben would start to understand. And once you understood, you couldn't go back. So Jacen gave him half-truths, small fragments, enough to shape the path, but not the destination. He told himself it was protection, but even that word began to sound thin in his mind. In the quiet moments, when Ben left the room, Jacen would sit alone and wonder how many lies the future needed, how many betrayals could still be considered strategy, and whether love, when hidden behind orders and silence, still counted as love at all. He thought of Tenel Ka. She hadn't heard from him in days. The last message was short, emotionless, intentional, because she would hear the difference. She would sense the space in his voice, the place where Jacen used to be. He didn't tell her what happened, didn't speak the name, because if he did, she might say something that could still reach him. And he couldn't afford that. Not now. Not with so much already set in motion. Lumia warned him that hesitation kills empires before they're born, and Jacen had seen enough of history to believe her. The people who hesitated were the ones history forgot. They were the ones who tried to save both the world and their conscience, and ended up saving neither. There was a price to clarity. It was the look in Ben's eyes when he asked a question and got no answer. It was the silence in Jacen's voice when he thought about who he used to be. And it was the knowledge that from this point forward, nothing he said could ever mean the same thing again. Because behind every word now was a shadow. Not all betrayals are loud. Some happen in quiet conversations, in promises not made, in trust that slowly drains until there's nothing left to stand on. Jacen had begun breaking those bonds long before anyone noticed. When Luke asked for help, he offered strategy, not presence. When Leia called him her son, he answered like a soldier. When Jaina looked into his eyes, she saw someone looking past her. It wasn't anger, he still loved them, but he loved something else more now. A future they couldn't yet imagine, a peace that demanded obedience before it could offer hope. And to build that future, he had to be alone. Lumia never told him what friends he'd lose. She didn't have to. The Sith teachings made it clear. Attachments weren't just dangerous. They were barriers, soft places in your armor, open doors others could use to pull you back into doubt. Jacen wasn't doubting anymore. Every part of him that once questioned whether he could do this had already been silenced. What remained was a plan. The first step was isolating himself, not physically, but spiritually, to speak to the council with courtesy, but no conviction, to offer them solutions that seemed cooperative, even as they pulled power further into his hands. To let Mara think he was just tired, overworked, caught between visions, but he wasn't caught. He was choosing, and every choice was one more thread cut. The final thread came in the form of silence. He stopped calling his mother. He stopped responding to Jaina. He stopped walking beside Luke. Because each of them, knowingly or not, would pull him backward. They would ask him questions he wasn't ready to answer. They would remind him of a boy who thought peace came from listening. And they would see the cracks that were now too wide to cover. Even Alana, even Tenel Ka. He told himself he could protect them by leaving them behind. But protection without presence becomes a kind of abandonment. And he knew it. Every step forward toward power meant leaving something behind. Not just people, but promises. He had once promised to train Ben without leading him astray. He had once promised to return to Tenel Ka and raise their daughter together. He had once promised himself that he would never become like his grandfather. He broke all of them, quietly, deliberately. Because the truth was, Jacen wasn't trying to avoid becoming Vader. He was trying to become something worse, something the galaxy would never try to fight again. Someone so feared, they wouldn't need to raise their voice. And in that goal, every bond was a threat. The more he tried to protect others, the more they resisted, the more they begged him to explain, and with every question, he felt the temptation to answer. So he stopped explaining. He stopped defending. He let the rumors grow. He let the mistrust build. Because if they hated him, they wouldn't try to save him. And if they didn't try to save him, he could finally finish what he started. Mara wasn't afraid of Jacen, not at first. She knew what darkness looked like. She had walked through it, worked for it, killed in its name, and she knew the difference between someone falling and someone already gone. But Jacen still smiled, still offered calm words, still carried the voice of reason. It took time before she stopped hearing him as her nephew and started hearing him as something else. The clues were never dramatic. They were in the pauses, in the way he spoke about the future as if it had already happened, the way he used Ben's loyalty like a tool, not a trust, and the way he looked through people instead of at them, as if measuring their usefulness before he listened. She followed him quietly, long before he knew. Because, unlike the others, Mara didn't ask for permission to understand someone. She watched. And when she watched Jacen, she saw the boy she once trusted, but no longer recognized. She didn't tell Luke. She didn't tell Ben. She kept it to herself, not out of secrecy, but out of fear. Because what she saw wasn't just a shift. It wasn't just pain. It was belief. Cold, steady belief. The kind that couldn't be argued with. The kind that had already decided who had to die. When she confronted him, it wasn't set a warning. It was an attempt to stop something that couldn't be stopped. She didn't bring a team. She didn't wait for backup. She came alone, not because she underestimated him, but because she still hoped there was something left of Jacen in there. Some tiny thread of the boy who laughed with Ben. The Jedi who once questioned his every decision. The son who asked for stories about Anakin Skywalker just to understand what not to become. But what she found was Darth Caedus. No mask, no ceremony. Just a quiet, final moment in a shadowed hallway beneath the temple. She fought not to kill, but to reach. He fought not to defend, but to erase. Because the last light looking for him had to be put out. Mara was never weak, but she was still human. And in that final moment, when her body fell still, it wasn't rage in Jacen's eyes. It was silence. Because something in him knew, if she had reached him a year earlier, maybe she wouldn't have needed to die. But she had come too late. Or he had left too soon. Either way, it ended the same. A mother silenced. A nephew hardened. A boy fully gone. And the galaxy didn't know it yet, but Darth Caedus was no longer just a name. He was now the future. One with no one left to stop him. He believed if he could name it peace, then it would become peace. That if he removed the loudest dissenters, then silence would echo into obedience. Darth Caedus didn't storm into the galaxy with rage. He moved through it like a shadow stretching from a dying star, slow, steady, and absolute. Systems bent to him not out of fear, but confusion. The lines between law and tyranny blurred so carefully, even the Jedi hesitated to speak. He didn't shout orders across battlefields. He sent whispers through back channels. He restructured fleets under the pretense of unity. He sanctioned invasions while writing treaties. One hand raised the flag of the Galactic Alliance, while the other slowly rewrote what that alliance meant. And for a time it worked. Planets that once rebelled against central authority found themselves aligning with it, not because they were inspired, but because they couldn't tell what resistance looked like anymore. The Jedi felt it first, not all at once, but like a tide changing underneath their feet. Reports began to shift in tone. Missions authorized by Caedus ended in disappearances. Civilian unrest was labeled terrorist ideology, and yet when questioned, Caedus always had data, always had logic, always had the appearance of calm. He didn't scream like Palpatine. He didn't lose control like Vader. He simply erased threats before they became visible. But there were cracks. Whispers in the temple halls. Jedi masters meeting in private, speaking not of battle plans, but of fears, that maybe Jacen Solo had not returned from the unknown regions, that the man now leading their government still wore his voice, but not his heart, and yet none could prove it, because every action Caedus took could be justified. Every disappearance had a reason. Every shadow had a light shining somewhere nearby to distract from it. Ben Skywalker watched closely. The boy who once followed Jacen like a student does a star, now felt its gravity pull too hard, and Caedus knew it, but he didn't correct Ben. He didn't reassure him. He simply smiled and gave him more responsibility. Because power, when handed down gently, doesn't feel like corruption. It feels like trust, and Ben still needed someone to trust. The galaxy was quieter, but not still. Order had returned, but not willingly. People obeyed, but they no longer believed. And Caedus knew belief was dangerous. Belief created martyrs. Belief ignited rebellions. But if he could remove belief and leave only survival, then control wouldn't be questioned. it would be accepted. The problem was, the war he waged didn't stay in his hands. Peace, when forged by fear, doesn't last. It lingers like smoke after fire, never quite leaving, never truly clean. And somewhere in the dark, old enemies watched. New enemies learned, and the Jedi began to remember what they were meant to protect. The first of all were not enemies, they were doubts. Caedus understood that true control wasn't seized through armies, it was secured by erasing hesitation. His war wasn't against the Jedi. Not yet, it was against uncertainty, and every life he ended without anger, every secret he buried in silence, was a step toward clarity. He didn't kill for pleasure, he killed for alignment. Admirals who questioned the expansion of authority vanished from their posts. Senators who doubted emergency security bills suffered accidents or health failures that never raised alarms. It was surgical, invisible. Caedus didn't need to shout about power. He simply removed those who stood in its way and allowed their absence to explain itself. And the galaxy, still healing from war, still trembling from memory, accepted it because it didn't look like tyranny. It looked like peace with fewer voices, and silence is easier to govern. But the Jedi were not silent. Not all of them. Some began to speak again, first with questions, then with warnings. Caedus watched them carefully, especially his former friends, especially Luke. But Caedus didn't fear Luke's power, he feared the weight of his voice. One word from the Grand Master, spoken at the wrong time, could undo years of preparation, and so Caedus planned what he hoped would never be necessary, a scenario in which Luke would not live to speak. It was never carried out, not directly, but the intention lived in the shadows of every strategy Caedus built. He surrounded Luke with misinformation, false missions, manipulated reports. If he could not kill him without losing the Jedi Order, he would break his certainty, twist his instincts, lead him away from the truth just long enough to reshape it. And then there was Ben. Ben, who once called him Master. Ben, whose loyalty was once unconditional, now carried questions in his eyes, and Caedus could see it. The hesitation, the silent doubt wrapped in every nod of obedience. It would have been easier if Ben had hated him, but instead, the boy watched, measured, waited. And that was far more dangerous. Because Caedus knew what that patience meant. He had once looked at the galaxy the same way, not with rebellion, but with a quiet plan, and plans, when built on silence, become execution without warning. Still, Caedus believed he could control it, all of it. The unrest, the suspicion, the disloyalty. Because he was no longer Jacen Solo, he had sacrificed that name, and all the attachments tied to it, for the galaxy's future. But power creates echoes. And some of those echoes return wearing the face of justice, or vengeance, or both. The assassins came not in cloaks, but in memories. Faces he once trusted, hands that once held his lightsabers, that once defended him. They didn't call it rebellion, they called it intervention, the beginning of a cure. But Caedus didn't see sickness. He saw misunderstanding, and he believed he could explain it. If given enough time, if they just listened. They didn't sit, because by then, they weren't listening to Jacen Solo. They were hunting Darth Caedus. He had expected resistance, but not this. Not the slow unraveling of control from the inside out. Not the quiet refusal of systems that once bent the knee to the Solo name. Darth Caedus believed in a future without war, but he was building it with threats, manipulation, and fear. And the galaxy, tired and bloodied though it was, remembered how those tools had been used before, by Palpatine, by others who promised security in exchange for silence. And this time, some refused to be quiet. Caedus tightened his grip. He began bypassing the Senate, enforcing laws through military presence rather than debate. Intelligence officers were replaced with loyalists. Reports were rewritten before they reached the public. Peace, he insisted, was too fragile to be left to transparency. But peace built on secrecy has cracks too fine to see, until everything is falling. The core worlds obeyed, mostly out of fear, out of exhaustion. But in the mid-rim, in scattered sectors near the Hydean Way, whispers began to grow into movements. Resistance wasn't loud, it was coordinated, and it didn't always wear the symbol of the rebellion or the Jedi. It wore civilian badges, doctors refusing to falsify casualty reports, couriers smuggling encrypted messages between sectors, HoloNet engineers broadcasting corrupted feeds to reveal what the government buried. It was rebellion without guns. It was truth used like a weapon. Caedus saw it all, and instead of adjusting, he hardened. He increased surveillance, initiated loyalty screenings, authorized detention without cause. The list of enemies grew faster than the list of allies, and soon even his victories came with the aftertaste of paranoia. He never stopped believing in his mission, but belief doesn't protect you from exhaustion. It doesn't fill the silence of halls where your allies once laughed, or warm the coldness of a strategy room emptied by fear. He didn't speak to Tenel Cam anymore. The connection was too risky. He told himself it was for her protection, but part of him knew it was because she wouldn't look at him the same way. She wouldn't see a protector, she'd see a stranger wearing Jacen's face. And Alana, she'd ask questions. Jacen couldn't answer. Because Darth Caedus wasn't built for bedtime stories, he was built for sacrifices. He told himself the galaxy would understand. One day, when the war ended, when order was permanent, when the cost no longer mattered because the future had been saved. But futures built on fear don't remember the savior, they remember the shadow. And as fleets reorganized, as systems declared neutrality or vanished entirely from contact, Caedus began to feel it. Not defeat, but the truth he feared most. The galaxy was no longer his to command. Because power once claimed through fear must be maintained with blood. And the galaxy had bled too much. She was meant to replace him, not to destroy him. That was the lie he told himself every time he looked at her. Tahiri Vela, the girl who once stood beside Anakin, the girl who mourned him longer than the galaxy had patience for, the one Jacen believed could be saved, not through comfort, but through purpose. He gave her that purpose, but purpose without clarity is poison. She followed orders, she believed in his vision. At least in the beginning, he gave her secrets no one else was trusted with, missions no one else was permitted to touch. She learned to strike in silence, to suppress guilt, to carry out the cold logic he called peacekeeping. And yet, she hesitated. Not always, but enough. Enough to notice. She asked questions she wasn't supposed to ask. Not about the Jedi, not about the rebels, about him. Do you still hear the Force the same way you used to? Do you ever dream of the people you Sith lost? He never answered directly, not because he didn't know, but because some answers are more dangerous than silence. What Jacen feared more than failure was becoming unreadable to those who once knew him, and Tahiri still remembered him as a boy, a brother, a quiet learner with too many thoughts and not enough words. Now, he was a lord, and even she was beginning to feel the distance. When he ordered the assassination of a Bothan council leader, she carried it out, but her voice on the report was colder than it should have been. Not sharp, just hollow. That sips when he knew. She was watching him, not like an apprentice studies a master, but like a witness studies a criminal. Not with fear, with recognition. She saw something in him that couldn't be undone, not by explanation, not by victory. She saw a man who had traded humanity for control and didn't know how to turn back. And Jacen, Caedus, whatever name still held meaning, he didn't try to stop her, because part of him wanted someone to see it, to see the fire he had walked into, to see how far he had gone, even if they didn't understand why, especially if they didn't sit. Tahiri didn't sit betray him, not then, not fully, but her silence grew louder than her loyalty, and in that silence he saw the beginning of the end. An apprentice who no longer believed, a galaxy that no longer obeyed, a family that no longer looked for him. Jacen Solo, the boy who once smiled at animals and searched for balance in the Force, was buried beneath a name he couldn't escape. Darth Caedus. The war had not broken him, but the people he fought to protect had left him behind. And in the end, it wasn't blasters or fleets that sealed his fate. It was the eyes of those who once trusted him, now watching from the edge of the fire, waiting for it to burn out. She stopped waiting the moment she knew there was no one left to save. The Jedi Order had debated, hesitated, argued over what Jacen Solo had become, but Jacen didn't need more proof. She saw the reports, the massacres disguised as strategy, the fear in the eyes of allies who once trusted him, the silence from her own family, as if saying his name might summon more darkness. There was no council meeting that convinced her. There was only the truth. Jacen wasn't coming back. So she went after him. Not as a sister, not even as a Jedi. She became something else, something the galaxy hadn't seen in a long time. The Sword of the Jedi. Not a title she chose, not a destiny she chased, but a burden that found her the moment the Force needed a blade sharp enough to cut through bloodlines. And she hated it. Because when she tracked him across star systems, she wasn't chasing a Sith Lord, she was chasing memories of a brother who once walked barefoot on the metallic floors of a training room just to feel more grounded, of someone who held her hand after their cousin died, someone who never laughed loudly, but always made others feel less alone. That was the ghost she was chasing, the one that used to be Jacen. But there were no ghosts in Caedus, only a man who had made peace with being hated. The galaxy didn't see the cracks in him, but she did. Every time he spared a life when no one was looking. Every time he paused before giving an order that even he didn't believe in. He wasn't gone, he was buried, and Jaina was the only one left who could see the place where he disappeared. When she landed near his final stronghold, there was no battle cry, no dramatic entrance. She didn't come to redeem him, she didn't come to lecture him, she came with one mission, because if she didn't end this now, more would die, and some deaths cannot be justified, not even in war. Caedus knew she was coming. He felt her through the Force, long before her ship broke atmosphere. He didn't raise defenses. He didn't flee. He waited, like a man who always knew this was how his story would end. Not with a betrayal, but with a mirror. And as the twin suns turned red behind the clouds, the shadows of two figures met again, not as family, not even as Jedi and Sith, but as two people who had no one left to trust, except the person who now stood ready to kill them. They didn't speak when they met. There was no room for words between them now. Everything that should have been said had died years ago, back when Jacen still smiled like her brother and not like a stranger. The duel began in silence. Not the silence of peace, the silence of things breaking too loudly to be heard, of grief collapsing in on itself, of futures rewritten before they had time to arrive. Caedus struck first, not with the power of the Sith, but with the hesitation of a brother who still remembered her laugh. Jaina met the blow head-on. She didn't flinch, not because she was stronger, but because she had already mourned him. Long before this day came, long before he wore that name. The blades hissed, steel met light, force met force. To others, it might have looked like a battle between titans, the sword of the Jedi versus the Dark Lord of the Sith. But to them, it was something smaller. It was childhood and trust and late-night talks, all bleeding into a moment where none of it could be saved. Jaina moved faster than he remembered. She didn't hold back, not this time, because she knew the stakes, because he had taken too much from too many, and because if she hesitated, the galaxy would pay for it, just like Nalani did, just like Mara. He didn't sit plead. Even as she gained ground, even as his left arm failed him, even as her blade came closer to ending what the galaxy still hoped could be undone, Caedus didn't ask for mercy. Because he knew she wouldn't sit give it. And because he didn't sit want it. This was the cost, not of darkness, but of every choice that made him believe darkness was the only way. This was what it meant to walk alone long enough, that even family turned into shadows. And when he looked at her, not the Jedi, not the soldier, but his sister, he saw it in her eyes. She would carry this forever. The way he carried Anakin Sep's death. The way Leia still woke up whispering Alderaan. The way war leaves no one untouched, not even those who try to end it. They moved through the broken station like memories trapped in glass. Their strikes weren't just physical, they were echoes of pain, of protection, of moments they both wished had never happened. And though Caedus bled, though he stumbled, though the vision of peace he once clung to blurred in his mind, he didn't stop. Because there was still one thing left to do. One name left to protect. One life left that mattered more than his own. Jaina Sith's blade cut through the air with finality. Not anger, not revenge, just necessity. And still, he blocked it. Not because he believed he could win, not because he feared death, but because the moment hadn't come yet. The moment only he could feel pressing through the Force, the future that flickered like a dying star, always a few steps ahead of everyone else. He wasn't Sith trying to survive. He was trying to reach her. Tenel Ka. She was light years away, surrounded by guards, layered in power, but he felt her, not through their old connection as lovers, but through something smaller, something quieter, a sliver of knowing, a thread of fear. He had seen it, he had felt it, he had followed that vision through blood and betrayal, through loss and silence. through every lie he told himself in the mirror, trying to believe this was all for something greater. Someone was coming for her. Not just her, for Alana. And he wasn't Sith going to stop it with strength. He wouldn't Sith be alive long enough. So, in the final breaths of the fight, Jacen Solo did something Darth Caedus never would have. He lowered his blade, just slightly, just enough to let the Force move through him without the armor, without the mask, without the war. He reached out. Not to attack. To warn. To whisper a danger that only she would hear. It wasn't clean. It wasn't clear. The pain blurred the signal. The blood thinned the connection. But it was enough. She would know. She would feel the shift. She would move Alana to safety. And that was all he needed. He turned back toward Jaina. His stance faltered. His body was failing. But his eyes, the eyes that had once belonged to a boy who loved history and stars and quiet things, they held something that hadn't been there in years. Peace. Because this wasn't set surrender. It was completion. She advanced, and he didn't sit resist. Not fully. Just enough to make her trust it was real, that this was the end he had chosen. And in that final second, just before it came, he thought of Alana. Not the throne, not the legacy, just her. The way she laughed without permission. The way her hand had once found his, even when the galaxy called him a traitor. The way he had wanted to give her a galaxy that wouldn't need Sith or Jedi to protect it, just parents who stayed. He failed her, but he gave her this. A warning. A chance. He didn't raise his blade for himself. He raised it to buy time. And now, with that time spent, he let it fall. The blade entered cleanly. Not with a scream, not with defiance, just silence. Jacen Solo fell to his knees. Not as a Sith, not as a traitor, as someone who had run too far from home and finally stopped running. The war didn't Sith end. The galaxy didn't sit pause. But for 1 second, in the quiet between breaths, it felt like time bent around him, not in pain, in stillness. Jaina stood over him, her saber dimming. And for the first time in years, she saw him. Not the armor, not the mask. The boy who used to wait for her outside the temple gates. The brother who used to carry her when she limped home from training. The child who once asked her what love meant, as if it were a lesson that could be memorized. He didn't reach out. He didn't speak. But the Force did. It carried his thoughts like echoes trapped in glass, sharp, soft, unfinished. He wasn't sorry for becoming Caedus. He was sorry he believed that was the only way. He had tried to save too much, and in doing so saved nothing. He saw flashes in the dark, not memories, but the shadows of them. His father Sip's hand on his shoulder after Mark. His mother's voice, always one step behind his doubts. Vergere, whispering things that felt like truth, even when they tasted like poison. Tenel Ka, looking at him like he was still someone worth seeing. And Alana, never understanding what he was becoming, only trusting who he had been. He had wanted to control the galaxy to protect her. But maybe control was never protection. Maybe the Force didn't need rulers. Maybe it just needed people who remembered how to love, even when they were broken. His eyes didn't sit close. They stayed open. Not to resist death, but to witness it. To accept it as his last honest act. To leave without pretending. Because Jacen Solo had lied for too long. He had lied to his family, to the Jedi, to the Sith, to the galaxy. But the worst lie, the one that haunted him even now, was the lie he told the mirror. That he was doing this for peace. That he had no choice. That pain was worth it, if it kept others from feeling it. But pain doesn't disappear. It transfers. And all he ever did was move it forward. Jaina stepped back, her breath shaking. She didn't cry, not yet. But something inside her broke, not because she had killed a Sith, but because she had buried her brother. And somewhere in the Force, just far enough not to be heard but close enough to be felt, the boy he used to be smiled. Not in joy, not in victory, in relief. Because he didn't need to be remembered as Darth Caedus. He just wanted someone to remember the boy. The one who didn't know what he would become. The one who still believed he had time. They didn't speak his name after the war. Not at the funerals. Not in the Jedi temple. Not even when the silence asked for it. The galaxy had moved on, But the Jedi didn't forget, they just stored him in the places where mistakes go, behind closed doors, in archived hollows nobody accessed, in meditation sessions that paused when his image appeared. Not as Jacen, not even as Caedus, just absence. He was burned in the stars above Shidumad, not as a Sith, not as a hero, but as something in between, the kind of death that doesn't deserve ceremony, just necessity. Jaina didn't stay to watch. She left before the flames reached the body. She told herself there was no need to see it again, but she also knew she couldn't carry both the memory of him alive and the proof that he wasn't anymore. Ben Skywalker never asked questions, not out loud. He just observed how the older Jedi paused sometimes, during council meetings or lessons, as if they'd remembered something they weren't supposed to. And when his father, Luke, thought no one could hear, he'd whisper names into the Force. Most returned nothing, but Jacen's, sometimes, there was a ripple. Not a voice, not a ghost, just something that felt like waiting.
And a key.
The galaxy wasn't mourning. To most, Caedus was a threat, erased, an enemy destroyed, a war closed with the right ending. But Leia didn't celebrate. She didn't cry either. She just went quiet in the moments where mothers are expected to scream. She held her breath when people spoke of peace. And Han, who never believed in softness, stared longer at the stars each night, like he was counting which ones still looked back. There was no statue, no recording, no journal kept in his memory. Only the emptiness left in others, shaped exactly like the man who once tried to save the galaxy by controlling it. A wound doesn't it always bleed? Sometimes it just stops being mentioned. There were questions no one dared to voice. Not because the answers were dangerous, but because they might not exist. What did Jacen see during those years he wandered alone? What version of the future made him believe pain was the price of peace? The Jedi archived everything they could, his missions, his choices, the moment he crossed the line, but the one thing they couldn't capture was why. Because Jacen didn't leave behind a confession. He didn't write manifestos or record holocrons to explain himself. He simply acted, like time was closing in on something only he could stop. And now that he was gone, the galaxy kept functioning. The wars quieted, the factions receded, but that made it worse, not better. Because what if he had been right? What if the very future he was trying to stop had already been delayed? Tenel Khan never spoke publicly about him, not as her daughter's father, not as the man who once saved her life, and certainly not as the one who became Darth Caedus. But late at night she sat beside her sleeping child and looked at the stars the way soldiers look at battlefields long after the war has ended. Not with fear, but with memory. She told Alana stories of Jedi and queens, of courage and sacrifice. She never said Jacen Sith's name, but Alana asked anyway. She asked why her mother's eyes looked tired when they passed a Jedi temple, why her dreams sometimes echoed with names she hadn't heard aloud, and why her hand felt warm when she held her lightsaber, like someone else had touched it first. There are truths children carry before they understand them. Alana felt her father in the Force. Not like a ghost, more like a fingerprint. Every time she reached for her strength, part of it traced back to something broken, something silenced, something that had loved her enough to die without asking her to understand. There were places Jacen Solo had stood that no one ever walked again. Corridors in the Anakin Solo, once his command ship, that remained sealed. Rooms in the Jedi Temple that bore his voice in memory, even if the hollow recordings were erased. And there were footsteps in the Force, invisible but real, where his presence had pressed too deeply to fade. Luke Skywalker never spoke of it in public, but he knew the weight of those echoes. He had felt them after Vader. Now he felt them again, not as darkness, not as threat, but as silence that refused to go away. Jacen Sith's presence didn't set to return as a haunting. It returned as absence that shaped everything around it. The Jedi who once followed him didn't speak his name. Not from shame, but because it felt like speaking it would summon the weight again. Ben Skywalker still carried the scar. Not just the one on his skin, the one Jacen left when he tortured him, but the scar behind it, the knowledge that someone he once trusted more than anyone else had used that trust as a weapon. And yet, when Ben dreamed, when he reached into the Force without control, sometimes the first voice he heard was still Jacen's. Teaching, explaining, hoping. Because Jacen never stopped believing in his own intentions, even at the end. even when the galaxy screamed at him that he was wrong. That SIP's what made it harder to erase. Villains are easy to condemn. But what do you do with someone who broke the galaxy trying to fix it? How do you bury that kind of love? The kind that chose war so others could avoid it? The kind that killed while imagining peace? The Jedi didn't build a statue. The Senate didn't hold a hearing. But in quiet places, in the stillness between systems, in the temples that no longer taught his name, Jacen Solo remained. Not as a warning, not as a legend, but as a question the Force hadn't answered. Time doesn't erase everything, it just makes silence thicker. Decades passed, new wars came, new heroes, new betrayals. But those who truly listened to the Force, not for guidance, not for power, but for memory, sometimes heard something they couldn't name. Not a presence, not a warning, just a pause, a breath between destinies. Some Jedi called it nothing, others weren't so sure. One night, years after Caedus's fall, walked alone on a moon once visited by the fallen Solo. She paused in the middle of a crater, sensing something beneath the surface, a calm beneath violence. She didn't hear his voice, she didn't see his ghost, but she wept. And when she returned to the temple, she couldn't explain why. Not evil, not forgiven, just waiting. There were records in the archives that remained redacted, not because of secrecy, but because no one could agree how to explain them. Was he a Sith? Yes. Was he a traitor? Yes. Was he a father? A brother? A man who thought he saw tomorrow clearer than anyone else? Also, yes. The Force did not give closure. It never does. It lets things fade, but only when they've been seen. Jacen Solo was not seen, not fully, not by the Jedi, not by the Sith, maybe not even by himself. But the Force remembered, in the smallest ways. In the instinct a mother felt to protect her child, seconds before danger. In the choice a soldier made to hesitate, even when ordered not to. In the quiet moment when an apprentice questioned their master, not out of disobedience, but out of belief. Those things didn't come from Jacen, but they came from the space he left behind. His story didn't end with death. It ended with a silence that made others listen harder. That's how echoes work. They don't just speak louder. They remind you that something was once said. And maybe if you're quiet enough, you'll hear what it meant.